She opened her door, glanced at my outfit, and teased, "You came dressed like that?" I smiled back and said, "You haven't complained yet." That was the moment our story began. It started with nothing more than a knock on her door. I wasn't planning on making an impression. In fact, I hadn't given a second thought to how I looked when I left my apartment. A plain shirt, jeans, hair a little messy from the evening breeze, I thought it was enough for a casual visit to my neighbor's place. She'd invited me before, usually with a warm smile, sometimes just to borrow something or to share a cup of tea. Tonight felt no different. Or at least, that's what I thought. When the door swung open, the first thing I noticed was her. Always her. She stood there framed by the soft, golden light spilling from inside, wearing a loose sweater that somehow carried more elegance than anything designer ever could. Her hair fell just past her shoulders, framing her face in a way that drew me in without effort. And then came the words that would set the tone for the entire evening. "You came dressed like that?" Her voice carried that playful lilt she had mastered, a mixture of teasing humor and quiet challenge. It wasn't harsh, not even close. Instead, it had that curious quality that made me feel like she saw straight through me, as though she expected more. I froze for just a second, half embarrassed, half amused. I looked down at myself and chuckled softly. Jeans and a faded shirt weren't exactly glamorous. But the smirk tugging at the corner of her lips told me she wasn't offended, she was entertained. So I leaned into it, meeting her gaze with a crooked smile of my own. "You haven't complained yet." Her eyes lingered on me, longer than I expected. For a moment, there was silence. Not uncomfortable, but charged. The kind of silence that feels like a test, like both of us were daring the other to take the next step. Then she shook her head lightly, a quiet laugh slipping past her lips, and stepped aside to let me in. The simple act of crossing her threshold always did something to me. Her home wasn't grand, but it had a warmth that made it feel alive. A lamp glowed softly in the corner, casting shadows against the framed photographs along the wall. The faint scent of vanilla candles mixed with something distinctly hers, subtle perfume that clung to the air like memory. I slipped off my shoes and followed her inside, still thinking about that first remark. It wasn't just the words, but the way she said them. Like she cared enough to notice, but not enough to hide her amusement. It made me want to laugh at myself, to let my guard down in a way I rarely did around anyone else. She moved gracefully toward the kitchen, asking casually if I wanted tea or something stronger. The ease of her movements, the way she carried herself, reminded me of someone comfortable in her own skin, confident, but never loud about it. I found myself watching her more than I should, memorizing the little details, the way her hair brushed against her cheek, the faint lines near her eyes that only made her smile more genuine. I sat down, still hearing her words echo in my head. "You came dressed like that?" It had been a tease, yes, but it also felt like an invitation. An opening for something playful, something unspoken that we both sensed but hadn't yet named. And though I hadn't admitted it to myself before, my reply carried more truth than I realized. "You haven't complained yet." Because deep down, I didn't want her to complain. I wanted her to notice. To see me, not just as the young neighbor who came by now and then, but as someone she could speak to, laugh with, maybe even lean on. That night, as I sat across from her in the warm glow of her home, I felt something shift. Subtle, quiet, but undeniable. The evening had only just begun, but I already knew nothing about it would be ordinary. The moment I stepped further into her home, I felt it again, that strange blend of comfort and awareness that always seemed to surround her. Her place wasn't extravagant, but it carried her personality in every corner. Warm light from a single lamp softened the living room, giving the space a golden, almost nostalgic hue. The faint hum of the city outside was muted here, replaced by the crackle of the candles she had burning on the table. She motioned toward the sofa with an easy smile, as though it was the most natural thing for me to be there. I sat down, and the cushion gave under my weight, warm from where the lamp's glow had been pressing. I caught myself tracing the little details around the room, framed photographs of places she'd visited, books lying neatly on the shelf, and a soft throw blanket draped across the armrest. Everything about her home felt lived in, curated, but never staged. When she walked in with 2 cups of tea, I couldn't help but notice the grace in her movements. She wasn't trying to impress, she didn't have to. She set the cup in front of me with a small nod, her fingers brushing mine just slightly as she passed it over. A simple gesture, but it sent a ripple through me, quiet but sharp. Our conversation started where most do, safe, easy topics. She asked about my day, and I gave her the short version. She spoke of hers, casually mentioning errands, work, the mundane rhythm of her week. But in her voice there was always a little melody, like even the simplest details carried weight when she spoke them. The longer we talked, the more I noticed her presence, not just in what she said, but in how she listened. She had this way of leaning forward slightly when I spoke, eyes steady, as though my words mattered more than they deserved. It disarmed me, made me want to share more than I usually did. At one point, I tried to joke about my own plain appearance, circling back to her opening remark at the door. She laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that filled the room and seemed to linger in the air. "You're too easy to tease," she said, shaking her head, strands of hair falling across her cheek. Without thinking, I found myself staring just a moment longer than was polite. The light caught her features in a way that made them seem timeless, graceful lines, the kind that come from living, not from hiding life away. She noticed, I think, because her smile softened, and for a fleeting second, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was something else, a pause heavy with awareness. I broke it by asking about the photographs on the wall, and she seemed relieved, answering with stories of places she had traveled to years ago. Her eyes lit up as she spoke about standing on a mountain trail at sunrise, or wandering a small European street in the rain. I listened, absorbed not just by the stories but by the way they shaped her. I realized then how different we were, not just in years but in experience. She had lived, seen, felt things I hadn't yet touched. And still, here she was, speaking to me as though the difference didn't matter. At some point, she tucked her legs beneath her, sitting comfortably on the sofa across from me, her elbow resting on the armrest. Her hand dangled casually near where my arm rested, close enough that her fingers brushed against my sleeve when she shifted. It was so slight, almost accidental, but it stayed with me. My skin tingled where her touch had grazed, my chest tightening with the sudden realization of how much I wanted to feel it again. We carried on like this, words mingling with pauses, laughter filling the spaces between. There was nothing extraordinary about what we talked about, yet the evening itself felt quietly profound. She didn't have to say anything bold, and neither did I. The unspoken lingered between us, like a note held in the air, waiting for the right moment to resolve. I leaned back against the cushion, tea cooling in my hands, and realized something simple but undeniable. This was no longer just a neighborly visit. It was something else. Something beginning. The tea between us had grown lukewarm, forgotten somewhere between her stories and my quiet listening. The conversation shifted without planning, as conversations often do when the walls around two people begin to lower. What started with travel and books slid into something heavier, something real. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on a photograph on the far wall, one I hadn't asked about earlier. A picture of her standing beside a man, smiling brightly, framed in the glow of a summer afternoon. She didn't speak right away, but I caught the faint change in her expression, the softness that only comes when memory tugs too strongly. "My husband used to love that place," she said finally, her voice steady, though quieter than before. "He was always working, always traveling, but he made time for that trip." Her words hung in the room like dust caught in sunlight. Not bitter, not mournful, just honest. I shifted slightly, not wanting to intrude, but unwilling to retreat into silence. "It looks like a good memory," I said softly. She nodded, eyes still on the photo, then turned back to me with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It was. But things change. They always do." Her tone carried no invitation for pity. She wasn't asking for comfort, only stating a truth. Yet I felt something stir inside me, the urge to offer her more than silence, more than polite acknowledgement. But what could I say? I was younger, less experienced, still learning how to hold my own life together. What right did I have to speak into hers? And yet, when she looked at me again, there was something there, something that suggested she wanted me to try. "You're too serious for your age," she said suddenly, breaking whatever weight had settled between us. Her lips curled into the smallest smirk, though her eyes still carried the shadow of her confession. "Most men your age wouldn't sit here listening to me talk about, well, any of this." I let out a quiet laugh, not defensive, just honest. "Maybe. But I like listening." Her gaze lingered on me, steady, searching. It wasn't just a look, it was an evaluation, a test, as if she were trying to decide whether I meant it. I didn't look away. That's when it happened, so small it could have been nothing, but to me, it felt like everything. She adjusted in her seat, leaning her elbow against the armrest. Her hand, almost casually, brushed against my sleeve. A second too long for an accident. I felt the warmth of her skin through the fabric, subtle but electric. My breath caught, though I hid it behind a sip of tea that no longer tasted of anything. She didn't apologize, didn't pull back abruptly. Instead, she let the moment pass naturally, her voice steady as she asked me about my family, my life, what I wanted beyond the confines of this apartment building. But beneath her words, I felt something shift. The air between us was no longer simply comfortable. It was alive, charged with something neither of us dared name aloud. As I spoke, I noticed her watching me, not in the way a neighbor listens, but with a depth that felt almost dangerous. Admiration, curiosity, maybe even longing, though I tried not to convince myself of something that wasn't there. Still, I couldn't shake the thought, maybe she saw me as more than the boy next door. Maybe she was beginning to see me as a man. And the truth was, I wanted her to. When silence fell again, I let it linger this time. Her fingers still rested near mine, the faintest brush a reminder that connection doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with the smallest touch, and the courage not to pull away. That night, sitting across from her, I realized something important. Attraction isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet thing, whispered through glances and pauses, through the space where two lives overlap for just long enough to feel inevitable. And in that quiet, I felt myself leaning, not forward physically, but inward emotionally, toward her. Toward the possibilities she represented. The night had deepened without us noticing. The teacups sat forgotten, the room quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside. At some point, she suggested we step onto the balcony for fresh air. I followed her, and the shift in setting felt like crossing into another chapter of the evening. The balcony overlooked the city, a quilt of flickering lights stretched against the night sky. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint breeze that lifted strands of her hair and brushed them across her face. She stood near the railing, resting her hands lightly against it, her figure framed by the glow of the city behind her. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just watched her, the way she belonged to that moment, calm yet undeniably striking. It wasn't just her appearance, though that alone had a way of making me forget words. It was something deeper, something in the way she carried herself, as though she had weathered storms and learned to stand stronger because of them. She glanced over her shoulder and caught me watching. Instead of turning away, she held my gaze. "What do people your age usually do at this hour?" she asked, her voice soft, almost curious. I smiled, tucking my hands into my pockets. "Depends. Some are out with friends, some are trying to sleep off the day, and me?" I paused, letting my words land with intention. "Right now, I'd rather be here." Her eyes lingered on mine, and I caught the faintest shift in her expression, something between surprise and something else she didn't name. She looked away then, out at the skyline, but the silence that followed was telling. She wasn't brushing my words off. She was holding them, carefully. I stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to feel the warmth radiating from her despite the cool air. The railing stretched between us like a neutral line, and when my hand settled casually against the metal, I felt hers nearby. A small distance, no more than a breath. The breeze carried the scent of her perfume again, subtle and steady, mixing with the night air. My chest tightened with the awareness of how close we were. Every fiber of me wanted to close that small gap, to let my fingers brush against hers, to let the truth I had been circling all evening finally slip free. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I leaned against the railing, matching her posture, giving her the choice of whether to stay near or step away. She didn't move. Her hand remained where it was, close enough that the space between us pulsed like an unspoken secret. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked, my voice low, unsure if I had crossed into something too personal. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Regret what?" "Living differently. Slower. Quieter." Her lips curved into a half smile, the kind that revealed nothing yet carried everything. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But nights like this remind me that quiet can be enough." Our eyes met again, and this time neither of us looked away quickly. The silence that followed was thick, humming with all the words either of us had the courage to say aloud. Her hair brushed against her cheek once more, and before I could stop myself, my hand twitched with the instinct to reach out, to smooth it back, to let my fingers linger against her skin. I stopped halfway, tightening my grip on the railing instead. She noticed. I know she did. Her lips parted slightly, as though she might speak, but the words never came. Instead, she breathed out slowly, a sound barely louder than the night breeze, and for a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. It wasn't a confession, not yet. But it was close, so close that one more glance, one more brush of fingers, one more fragile breath could have tipped us over the edge. And maybe neither of us was quite ready. When we stepped back inside, the warmth of her living room felt heavier than before, like the air itself carried the charge of whatever had just lingered between us on the balcony. She walked ahead of me, her steps unhurried, the soft fabric of her sweater brushing against her frame as though the night itself had softened her edges. "Wine?" she asked, her voice lighter now, almost as if she needed the change in rhythm. "Wine sounds good," I said, grateful for something to ground us again. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the familiar clink of glasses, the subtle pop of a cork. The sounds alone carried a kind of intimacy, domestic in a way that made me feel both comfortable and strangely out of place. This wasn't my home, and yet, sitting there on her sofa, it felt like somewhere I belong. When she returned, she carried 2 glasses with care, the deep red catching the lamplight as she placed one in my hand. As she leaned forward to pass it, her shoulder brushed mine. A small thing, ordinary even. But the warmth of her touch spread through me like a slow current, leaving me too aware of how close we sat. "Cheers," she said simply, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers. "To what?" I asked, smiling. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but close. "To neighbors who don't mind being teased about their wardrobe." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're not going to let that go, are you?" "Not a chance," she said, sipping her wine. Her eyes glimmered with quiet amusement, but there was something beneath it too, a softness that hadn't been there earlier, like the teasing had shifted into something gentler. I leaned slightly closer, lowering my voice as though what I said next needed to be shared in confidence. "Well, you still haven't asked me to leave." Her laughter faltered, replaced by a stillness that seemed to press into the space between us. She set her glass down carefully on the table, her fingers lingering on the stem a moment longer than necessary before pulling back. When she looked at me again, the humor was still there, but muted, softened by something deeper. "You're bold," she said finally, her tone low, thoughtful. I shrugged lightly, trying to disguise the truth with a grin. "Or maybe just honest." For a moment neither of us moved. The lamplight wrapped us in a cocoon of warmth, the shadows deepening around the edges of the room as if the world beyond her walls no longer mattered. Her hand rested on the cushion between us, inches from mine. Without thinking, I let my fingers settle near hers. Not touching. Not yet. But close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She noticed, of course she did. Her gaze flicked down briefly, then back to me. Instead of pulling away, she shifted slightly closer, her knee brushing mine. It was so faint I almost wondered if I imagined it, but the heat that followed told me otherwise. The banter returned, but it carried a new rhythm now. Slower. More deliberate. She teased me about being too young to appreciate good wine. I teased her back about being too wise to waste it on me. Each word was threaded with a quiet daring, as if we were both testing the limits of how far this game could go before it turned into something neither of us could dismiss. At one point, she reached for her glass again, and her hand rested lightly on mine as she passed. Just a brief press of warmth, intentional this time. My chest tightened, not with nerves, but with the simple, undeniable realization: this wasn't an accident anymore. Her laughter softened into a smile that lingered even after the sound faded. "You should be careful," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I might start believing you mean the things you say." I met her eyes, steady and unflinching, the humor gone from my voice now. "Maybe I do." The air between us thickened, fragile yet undeniable. The playful teasing, the light touches, the shared glances, they had become something more. Something that could no longer be brushed off as coincidence. And though no promises were spoken, no bold confessions made, we both knew a line had been crossed. Gently, quietly, but crossed all the same. The wine had loosened our words, but not in the reckless way it sometimes does. Instead, it softened the edges, letting truths slip through that might otherwise stay locked away. We sat close now, the quiet hum of the city outside no match for the stillness of her living room. The lamplight had dimmed as the bulb warmed, casting us in a gentler glow, like the night itself had conspired to make this moment feel fragile and whole. She rested her glass on the table, turning it slowly between her fingers, her eyes tracing the curve of the glass rather than meeting mine. "You know," she began, her voice softer than it had been all evening, "it's been a long time since I've let anyone sit here with me like this." Her words sank into me, heavy with more meaning than she admitted. I wanted to ask why, but I stayed quiet, waiting. She sighed gently, as though debating whether to keep going. "Most of my days feel predictable. Manageable. But predictable. And then you knock on the door, looking the way you do, saying the things you say, and suddenly it's like..." She trailed off, shaking her head with a rueful laugh. "Like I've stepped out of the rhythm I've lived in for years." I watched her carefully, my chest tightening at the vulnerability in her words. She wasn't trying to impress me, she was letting me see her, unpolished and real. I swallowed, my voice low when I finally spoke. "I don't see you the way you think I do. Not just as my neighbor. Not just someone older. When I'm here, I forget about all that." Her gaze lifted, meeting mine fully now. The air between us thickened, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Her eyes searched me, steady but uncertain, as if she was testing whether my words carried weight. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. But her tone betrayed her. It wasn't a warning. It was an admission. I leaned forward slightly, not closing the distance completely, but enough that she could feel the sincerity in the space between us. "Why not? Because it's true?" Her breath caught, subtle, but unmistakable. She placed her hand on the cushion between us, the same place our fingers had hovered earlier, but this time there was no hesitation. Her fingertips brushed against mine deliberately, lingering. "You make me feel..." She paused, her eyes flickering down to our hands. "You make me feel younger than I am. Alive, in a way I didn't expect." The simplicity of her confession struck me harder than any grand declaration could have. I turned my hand just enough so that our fingers aligned, touching more fully now. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, grounding me, steadying me. I spoke carefully, every word deliberate. "I don't want to make you feel younger. I want to make you feel seen." Her lips parted, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Her eyes shimmered with something she fought to contain, something between fear and longing. "You're too young to know what to do with words like that," she said, though her voice trembled on the edges. I shook my head, my thumb brushing against her hand in the lightest of touches. Maybe. But I know how I feel when I'm here with you. That's enough for me. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second stretching into the weight of silence. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she let her fingers curl slightly against mine, as if testing the reality of this connection. Her gaze lingered, unblinking, and in it I saw everything: the hesitation, the conflict, the desire she couldn't quite deny. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. But it was honest. And in that honesty, we finally crossed into something that could no longer be undone. The silence between us stretched, not awkward, not heavy, but full. Her hand remained in mine, her fingers curled slightly, as though she'd stopped fighting the impulse to pull away. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, the night deepening around us, yet here we sat, two people caught in the fragile balance of something neither of us had expected when the evening began. She was the first to break the stillness. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes softened in a way that told me she was weighing her words carefully. "You make everything complicated," she whispered. I let out a quiet laugh, though my chest ached with the weight of the moment. "Or maybe simple," I countered. "I just don't want to pretend anymore." Her gaze held mine, unflinching now, though I saw the flicker of conflict behind it. She was strong, yes, confident in ways that made me admire her endlessly. But tonight, beneath the lamp's golden glow, she looked quietly vulnerable, as though she was finally allowing herself to be seen without any defenses. Slowly, she shifted closer, her knee brushing mine, her hand still warm in my grasp. Then, with a gentleness that made my breath falter, she leaned in and pressed a soft kiss against my cheek. It was brief, almost tentative, but it carried more meaning than any grand gesture could have. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling back just slightly, though not enough to sever the closeness between us. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "For being here. For seeing me, not just the version of me everyone else accepts without question." Her words struck me deeply, and I tightened my fingers around hers. "That's all I've ever wanted to do." For a long moment, we just sat like that, side by side, hands joined, hearts suspended in a quiet rhythm that neither of us wanted to break. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was the warmth of her presence, the closeness that had grown from playful teasing into something undeniably real. Eventually she leaned back, her expression steady now, though her smile carried a bittersweet edge. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "I don't know if this, us, has a place beyond tonight." Her honesty was sharp, but it didn't wound me. Instead, it grounded me. I nodded, my thumb brushing gently across the back of her hand. "Then we don't need to know yet. We just need to admit that it's here. That it matters." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something close to relief. She exhaled softly, as though a weight she'd carried had eased, if only slightly. And in that moment I knew we had reached something real, not a conclusion, but a beginning. When I finally rose to leave, the night outside had grown still, the city's hum reduced to a distant echo. At the doorway, she lingered, her hand resting lightly on my arm, the smallest of touches that said more than words could. "Good night," she whispered, her smile quiet but genuine. "Good night," I echoed, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. As I stepped out into the cool air, the door closing softly behind me, I felt the imprint of her hand on my arm, her kiss on my cheek, and the weight of her words etched into me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this: the connection we had shared tonight had changed something fundamental. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were something more. Something worth holding on to, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. 1L